welcome to the outpost of the People's Republic of Christchurch. It's great to have Tim here talking catalysing urban transformation in Europe. See, I picked the topic up completely.
Now spell it.
Yeah. Actually, that guy that...
Actually, I didn't check, but they like acronyms over there, and I think this is QT.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so that shut you up. That man that interrupted there was from Wellington, but that's it. We've all got our problems. He comes from Wellington. But I was, I think I confessed last week that I had a little bit of a hole in the program tonight, and
Needed a young speaker.
I needed a young speaker, and
Say that as a compliment, thank you.
yeah, compared to the rest of us, you know. I had a speaker all lined up, and he pulled out on Friday night.
He withdrew.
He withdrew. and that woman's been withdrawing all of her life. Anyway, and then Tim emailed me and said, I'd like to come along to the Tuesday Club. And I said, how would you like to come along to the Tuesday Club up the front? And so here he is. And it's great to have a Kiwi that's working in Europe. And it's around the world, people are struggling with all the same issues. We're rediscovering our villages, and that's hard work. And it's swimming upstream from where all the forces have gone over the last 30 years. And so it's great to actually have a Kiwi that's telling us what they're trying to do in Europe, because when you really think about Europe, they've hated each other for a long time. And so, welcome Tim. Says the Irishman.
Yeah.
Welcome Tim.
Testing. Is that working all right towards the back? Excellent. Oh, thank you, Gary. Thanks for the welcome. Yeah, that happened on probably about Saturday, where I was like, I have literally, here back for holidays, and Tony can attest the fact that I just had to blow the sand out of my USB drive in order to show up here tonight. So bear with me as this is a relatively quick path from Hi Gary to reviving the working cogs. He promised a friendly crowd, which was really nice, but he appears to have issued me with a helmet. Like the Blues Brothers movie with the mesh. But yes, I am working in Europe these days. I mean, I could have put in brackets there and New Zealand ? I suppose. I mean, this is home. I grew up around Christchurch. My family were out by Rangiora. Went to school and undergraduate here, and then I've sort of come and gone. Did a bit of time overseas, did my first main job in project management here with a local company, Octa, not so much in Christchurch as bouncing around New Zealand. Worked in the Maldives on tsunami reconstruction projects for a year. Did my master's in sustainability science in Sweden. Managed to import my now wife Nina from Slovenia in the process. And we got back a week before the February earthquake. So that was interesting timing. And I came back and worked for the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority and went quite quickly, which was, I guess for me, the earthquake process was, almost opportunity as much out of the crisis, which sometimes feels funny to say, but as it was. Is that banging around?
Yeah. Try that.
That's better. Okay. Thanks. And spent 4 years here working for EICA on energy stuff as part of Christchurch, working closely with people like Tony, and see a few familiar faces in the room, which is great. So it's been a while. And then we went in 2015, sort of that had kind of run its course. Spent a few years in London and worked for a couple of city or borough municipalities in London. London's got sort of 33 basically sub-cities. Also on trying to cook up crazy sustainable cities projects and battling away. And then joined Climate-KIC, which is a knowledge innovation community, and it's one of sort of a group of those set up around supporting innovation in Europe, but obviously around issues of climate change. And with them, have been lucky enough to take that work that I'll talk more about now to Slovenia, where Nina's from, where I'm now based. So anyway, that's a quick insight to my wee journey and connections back to this place. So thanks a lot for having me here, and Gary, Johnny, and it's a part of the city. It's been through an awful lot in the last 10 years, I guess. So always nice to acknowledge. And thanks all for coming. It sort of feels for me like a last minute invite, but I guess it's always like that on a Sunday for a Tuesday. Thanks a lot for the leap of faith of showing up. I hope it'll be interesting. What I said to Gary is I'm really keen actually to sort of catch up and get a deeper sense of what's happening back here. I freely admit to being relatively out of touch. So I'll offer up sort of what we're working on, and a lot of that's very much informed by what I learnt, by and large, the hard way here, 2011 to 15. So a big part of it. So very interested, I guess, just to hear what you think of that, and whether it's still relevant, and hopefully have some time to sort of hear from you about, well, if we took this thinking back into Christchurch, maybe what would happen, how does it fit, what's already happening that we could learn from and take to Europe. So it's always a bi-directional. Anyway, without further ado, 6:07, I'll try and not to go on for too long. As I say, Climate-KIC was set up to support innovation around climate. It's been around for 7 or 8 years. There's a number of these KIC models. I won't go into it too much. The idea was kind of relatively conventional, to take universities, find support entrepreneurs, companies, a bit of government, put them together and hope innovations happen that will help to solve for climate change. We supported lots of entrepreneurship programs, lots of startups and company development. None of which is bad, much of which is really interesting, none of which is anything close to sufficient. And I guess in the last year or two particularly, really sort of us as an organisation stepping back from what we have been doing and comparing it to the likes of this and saying, are we doing anywhere near enough? And accepting the answer is clearly not. None of us are. But what could we do differently? So we're, this is a product of how we're trying to work with cities. It is very much a work in progress, and it's quite a big reframe and rebuild for us as an organisation. It creates all sorts of challenges with governance and models and funders, etc. But at the same time, it's really, really exciting, and I think we are onto something. So the IPCC says that. And the world having to deal with emerging pandemics and stuff in real time is only not helping, of course. So we have to be able to deal with resilience challenges in real time and find a way to limit from a mitigation point of view. Our children have got it. And that's emerged very seriously, I think, in the last couple of years. And sort of put on a graph, from a European perspective, emissions have been tracking down. A lot of that's the easier stuff. It's definitely not really radically systemically different stuff by and large, as you can see, because it started kicking back up. The little dotted lines are sort of best guesses of how sort of current commitments might pan out. I think the white one, I think this one's Paris, so I think it's current Paris commitments. And yet, the work Europe needs to be at the forefront of this, and I would say New Zealand should be at the further in front again. So we're trying to find the places that can get from this trajectory to this trajectory. What would this mean? What would this entail? But then again, what would failure look like? IPCC says we've got 12 years. My daughter's 6. So we have to find a way
only
to...
11 now.
What's that? Oh, going on 11. Only 11 now. Yeah, well, it was 5 plus 12, but anyway. Yeah, I might be looking into those eyes. 12 years. So we've got a few scaling challenges here, but in terms of the slides. But so how do we build prosperity, inclusivity, resilience, and mitigate at the speed needed. No one knows how to do that. None of us are managing to get close. Many of you, I guess, are familiar with Cape Raworth's very helpful sort of putting all of this on one page. The outsides, the Stockholm Resilience Institute's 9 planetary boundaries, and the inside is, you could cut this slightly different ways, but you need all of those dimensions of life met to live well, and this is a global assessment of how we're doing. So climate change is off the page, but biodiversity loss is not far behind, and some of it we just don't even know. They're not white because they're fine, they're white because they didn't have the data. So this is sort of global assessment. It would obviously look different for New Zealand, but the goal being that how does humanity get within this band of living well enough and not breaking the planet. And to me that's, sustainability sort of beautifully captured on a page. It's still a complex looking thing, that's just the nature of the beast, but it's often perceived as worrying about the outside stuff over and above the inside. So how do we solve for all of that at once? And I guess that's, where we have climate in our name, but we have to put it in this kind of context. So it's definitely not by just supporting an ongoing suite of sort of point solutions and business innovation. Again, it's not bad, but it's definitely not sufficient. So this is why we're grappling with this. How do we work on innovation? As that's Climate-KIC's reason for existence as a knowledge innovation community. But how do we work on systemic innovation or transformational innovation that actually shifts the systems that lead to all of this, which are by people constructed intentionally or not, and our influence on people at the end of the day. So how do we move essentially our social systems fast enough? The environmental systems will either take care of themselves to our peril, or be solved kind of along the way. But it's a big change. It sounds, and sometimes I sort of hear myself saying it sounds quite simple, but of course it's horrendously complex. But so how do we find a way to do what must be done? And recognizing that most of our ways of working at the moment are set around doing what we feel can be done next. We're here, so what's the sort of incremental improvement we can make? What's the next step we can do? What's the next innovation? Which is very natural, very understandable, much easier in a sense. It's sort of, those are pieces we can bite off and do. But if you actually put that in context of what must be done, I was caught up with Tony beforehand, who's talking about this. Christchurch looks like I didn't catch exactly the level of commitment, but carbon neutral by 2045. The world needed Christchurch to be carbon neutral now, and still needs the world needs places like Christchurch to show that it can still be done in 5 or 10 years, not 20 or 50. Because we need everybody to be there by 2050, and there are places that have it a lot harder. So one of the key sort of, different departure points we're trying to take with our work, and it's got quite a flavour, I suppose, currency across Europe at the moment, is the idea of mission-led innovation. And the obvious and the most common analogy was the moon landing, and I think there's different layers to missions. So probably above this was a less clearly articulated mission of always beating the Russians or something like that. But once it became articulated as we are going to the moon, I don't know, you might, whether they put a time limit on it. Yes. As soon as possible, I guess. They had a date, end of the decade. We're going to the moon by the end of the decade. Yes. And it had social, for whatever mix of reasons. America went, yes, we are. Yes, we will. Not too hard. No, we can't do that. And it's a classic example of it's a kind of, in context of transforming social systems, maybe it's a very linear challenge, A to B, engineers, go nuts. But it was certainly in that case of ambitious enough, we didn't know how to do it, short timeline, and we proved it could be done. So how do we take that philosophy into our way of working and say, well, we're going to do that, we don't know how we will do it, but we're going to find a way, as opposed to we're here, and we know what we can do next. It's nice and safe, so let's just do that. So that's kind of, again, when you start to think about what would that mean, it means we have to work very differently. I was sort of I'm again quite out of touch with back home, and it's great to try and sort of plug back in and start to think about rebuilding those connections. Others will know more, like my brother-in-law, but this looks like a pretty good one. I'm sure there's details to it, but we're going to be predator-free. I think it's got a 2050. I think it would be good to see that shorter. But again, we clearly don't know how to do that at the moment. But it starts to focus resources, energy, innovation around why not. I've taken the liberty of having some guesses at other ones that we could have in New Zealand. Sorry, this is falling off the top, but it says by 2025 all Kiwis will live in a healthy, comfortable home that they can really afford. This one, I made these up, but before 2027, Canterbury will become the world's first fully organic food production region. All vehicles in Christchurch will be electric by 2024. You can create your own, in fact. There will be homework. But as soon as you start to put some of those stakes in the ground, and there is, you need process again to create those in a way that people are behind them. If it's just sort of one person's, it's just Tim's line, whatever. It doesn't have any strength or resilience over time as well. But if everybody said yeah, and I'm interested to hear. I guess, I saw that process kind of start in 2011 a bit, so I'm really interested to hear your take on sort of how has that played out here so far. But where I'm working now, based from Slovenia, much more in southeastern Europe, which is a challenge and a privilege, really fascinating. So with the cities of Maribor, Križevci, Sarajevo, Skopje and Niš, they're very different in type and size, across basically former Yugoslavia, Balkans region, and with no shortage of their own challenges. If we can get this sort of work done in Sarajevo, before Christchurch, that would be, that's probably my mission in life at the moment. I mean, here, and you hear a lot about immigration being a worry in Europe, but actually in this region, people are far more worried about emigration, feeling that whole generations are leaving because they're not keeping up. So at an initiative level, and I hope in each of the cities, they will, this will become more granular and their own version of it. But we said we're going to, our mission is to transform these cities into some of the best possible places as possible to live, work, and visit in Europe by 2025. And then, like I say, that's kind of like the beat the Russians level. I think others more expert than I would argue about the semantics of mission and goals and things, but there are missions and there are submissions and then there are goals. But air quality is a huge issue in these cities. Places like Sarajevo and Skopje gets as bad as what you hear from Delhi and others in the winter. Places with chronically bad air pollution are effectively taking years off children's education experience. You have to spend another year at school just to deal with the IQ loss of living in a badly polluted city, roughly, again. So for them, that is a key motivator. So we said, well, what if we set the mission is that air quality in our cities will be within safe limits by 2023. For us, obviously, with all the cities we're working with, the 2030 carbon neutrality goal is basically non-negotiable. So that's, again, that's sort of a stake in the ground from us as well. When we worked on the well-being aspect, that list just grew, but basically that's, again, everyone has the fundamentals of living well in the city. And we didn't get quite as specific about resilience, but reducing heat and flooding impacts. Again, this is work in progress, but it's how do we start to sort of get the level of ambition up and the timescale short enough? And as soon as you start to see these things, I would hope, I think I heard it, your imagination is running. You're all smart people and I guess been in this sort of game for a while, looking around the room. So it doesn't take much to imagine what it would actually take, at least in theory, to deliver on some of these. Anyway, it was just, there we go. That's fallen off the side anyway. There's 15 cities across Europe that is part of, this is, as I said, it's quite a new thing for us. We're trying to really rebuild and reframe our innovation programs with cities. So we've got 15 cities from the 5 I'm working with up to Edinburgh, Copenhagen, Malmö, some of Paris, some of Orléans in France, but some of those sort of usual suspects, if you like, but very different contexts as part of this kind of first group that we're trying to shape this with together. But why not, a New Zealand map of cities in New Zealand that are going on this journey in real time with us as well? I guess that's what I would love to see happen too. And the learning across cities, as I say, there's been a lot of enthusiasm for the sort of energy coming out of and the change coming out of New Zealand, particularly on climate action, strong government policy, etc. People in Europe are really excited by that too. So there's this enormous exportable potential from New Zealand, which in my experience is often underestimated here too. This you're not going to be able to read at all, so I'll have to sort of talk through it. But it's, I guess, getting into the next layer of theory, if you like, around what does it take to bring about really, really effective, real transformational change. It's not just a little bit here, and this is very much more about the how do we do things than the what do we need to do. Some of those missions were framed, just that I put up, were probably still not sufficient, because electrification, how? Electrification that, again, maybe like the housing, everyone can afford, or blending that mix of social goals alongside the sort of technical goals, I think is really critical. Because these have a huge bearing. I mean, in Christchurch, I spent 4 years trying to work on the district energy idea and get that to happen. And one of the shortcomings is there was no mission that we were responding to. It wasn't a bad idea. We made lots and lots of mistakes, learned a lot the hard way, and a lot of it's actually captured in here. But there's a big difference there's not a big difference technically between district energy systems. They supply heat and cool through a series of, something produces hot and cold water, you put it through pipes with pumps and have an exchanger at the end, and you monitor heat use. They're not that complicated. There's a few tricks to the engineering. But the difference from, say, Denmark, where they do the vast majority under cooperative systems, to then working on it in the UK or here, where the presumption was it was a private sector project. Well, that is the difference probably between a 12% return on investment expectation and maybe a 4%. And that 8% cost of capital makes the world of difference. So this, so thinking about the business models, like how will we do a district energy system, is much more critical than designing it. Of course, we fell into the same trap and rushed off and got some engineers to try and solve it. This is also very much a work in progress, but a framing of what does it take to do really change in a way that meets your prosperity, inclusivity goals as well as your technical goals. So collaborative communities, communication, citizen co-creation, collective management. Basically, how do we get much, much better at working together, and not just consultation around should we do this, or a strategy or a design stage, but actually collective models that last right into the future. There are lots of different models for that and different things you can use. Citizens' assemblies and cooperatives and all, etc. So different things will fit in different forms in different places. But you need to go through the work of working out and experimenting with what's going to work in your place. I'll talk a bit more about this, the economic parts. I'll come back. Up here we call it municipal momentum, given we're working in cities, but it's basically the sort of government realm. It's probably the clumsiest organisational readiness, but actually this makes a really big difference. In all of the cities we're working with, like the municipalities, feel fragmented, feel siloed, and also at the city level, so the sort of the municipal level and then the whole community level. Do we have the organisational models that would allow us to succeed and flourish? I'll come back to that. Do we have policy? And public procurement is a really important driver, and is it used in a way that's accelerating change, in a way that is getting what we want towards the mission, or not? Generally not. The opportunities of the 21st century offered up by data and digital systems. But data is only useful in the collective. My data on its own, much as I give it to Google, without not without question, but without much choice. On its own, it's kind of irrelevant. It's only in the aggregate that it's of value. So how do we, and so the idea of data commons, it's kind of the 21st century commons. We've missed the ball on land, we've dropped it on money, but we could still hold on to it for data. And if we learned how to do it really well, to manage data as a commons, could we get back? So of course it links to this collective management idea. And it's only really if data is held in a system that's trusted and collective, then it's available to everyone. And if it's available, then you have some technical stuff around how it talks to itself, which gets way beyond my area of expertise. And then if you have lots of data that's easily integrated, then you kind of get to the smart application world. Sorry, I'm trying to find the best place for this bit. Then you can do clever things with it. And so there's interdependencies between the different layers. I'll come back to the economic part in a bit more detail, but basically within the program design we have is putting these things first. So working on designing experimentation and new ways of working and new models for citizen engagement and democracy and governance, social innovation for the economic and the business case, for business models, for lots of elements from this kind of pie diagram. And starting with that stuff and then getting to the what do you want to work on. I have a sort of mental model, I suppose, like this tree on the wall a little bit, and it's actually a really good example. If the branches are the things every city needs to do, which was that sort of illustration we couldn't read earlier, we know we have to work on housing, the economy working, mobility, nature, integration of nature and biodiversity, education, health. We know basically every city tree, if you like, is broadly the same. And then it will bear the fruit for your community. This lady from Coanga, Kay Baxter, I think, her advice is if you want to plant a healthy fruit tree, you dig out a cubic metre of soil, and I use this often, to dig out a cubic metre and rebuild that ground before you plant a tree. And how often, who's done that? And there are lots of tree planting programs in the world where it's like we planted 100,000 trees and they're all dead the next year because it didn't rain.
My pot's okay.
So because I'm sure you're taking really good care of the roots. And so if you, in this metaphor, if you like, all of this stuff are the roots of the tree. And very often we leap into trying to sort of have a lot of work on a lot of branches and forget about what's under the ground. If we work on what's under the ground hard up front, the idea of grafting, I once saw a mango tree that had 26 different varieties on the same tree. So you can have a sort of bounty if you've done the work underneath. Very, very rarely. And how do you sort of go and convince the mayor or the government that we need 10 people to work on building a new collaborative model for the city? And they're like, well, but what are we going to have in 1 year delivered? Well, I'm not sure yet. We have to see what's going to work, and then we'll be able to do a mobility project. I know it's a hard sell. So I guess that's what we're trying to bring in. We have some really interesting organisations, sort of first group of those from across Europe, able to sort of help the cities designing out things in this space. We try and get our funding to sort of the resourcing of working on this. That's a long story, but it certainly can be done. I thought usually people are quite interested in the money piece. Like, well, if we're going to have that huge mission and it's going to cost billions, and at the moment we have budgets of a few 100,000, what do you expect us to do? That's a very common story everywhere. So I thought I'd just try and relatively, I have to speed up a wee bit, but relatively quickly unpack some of what's in this economic part around capital at the scale and speed that's really needed. So if you pick some of those missions, we need, yes, probably billions to be deployed in a few years when we're used to doing a much smaller scale, slower. We need business models through which it can work, and we need the economic structures that actually enable sort of revenue to be connected to the capital. There's no shortage of organisations that are actually interested to give capital to this sort of work. What bankers and so are usually looking for is, do you have a revenue stream to pay that off? And very often not. So this is some analysis by Material Economics. Don't worry about the numbers because it's just an example, an early example. It was done for Malmö. It was done around, what are the things that we would need to get done and it's not even, this doesn't even get to zero. This gets 75% in scope emissions by 2030. So there's the shopping list, if you like. We have to do those things and a bit more. And this is, I don't think was ever sort of, worked through for Christchurch, because like a district energy system just fits in here as one of those things. And again, don't worry about the numbers, but in this case they came up with a magical, inevitably wrong, but useful number of 1.596 million. So it's Malmö, so it's a bit different. It's 1.6 billion. We need to spend 1.6 billion over 10 years to get that job done. Okay. The great thing is the benefits to the community of doing that, both direct and indirect, are clearly bigger. It's a 41% return on investment in the world at the moment is a no-brainer. When you unpack that by sort of different members of the community, if you like, by type, start to see why it gets a lot more complicated. So sorry that these are falling off, but the city, municipality, citizens, property owners, you wonder why policies that try to get property owners to directly renovate their properties are struggling. Well, the costs in this case, but probably in most it's similar, are 60% higher than their direct benefits. Because there's nothing connecting the benefits of citizens, who are getting most of them, to those costs. So their business model can't stack up. None of which is insurmountable, but it's really, really common. If you organise that shopping list again by the sort of economic, so everything below the curve here is a good investment, everything above the curve is a bad investment. But again, mission-led approach, it all has to be done. So our conventional model, and working at ECA everywhere else, is sort of design programs that deliver these things, because these give the government or whoever the quickest, fastest, best return on investment today. Well, then who's paying for these? And if you say, well, look, we'll set up a private investment because we can do 12% return on investment here, and that's gone, then what model are you using to pay for this over time? If you restructure that in some sort of way that's solving for both of that, benefits and costs accruing to different people in a different way, and measure by measure the business cases are different. And this is where, sorry I don't have it, it's just done hypothetically. You can kind of get that whole bundle below the line. So that's still your 1.6 billion number. Now the whole thing makes financial sense. It might be whatever, 4%, not 12%. And then what's the blend? It's one of my colleagues, what's the stack of pancakes of different forms of capital that you need to get to that 1.6 billion? No one's got all of it. So it's this kind of upfront thinking work, and then obviously there's a whole heap of design to flow from this in terms of what sort of fund structure, etc., could make this possible. But do that work, and suddenly an enormous amount of branch work becomes possible. If you're just going project to project, which is really common everywhere, right across Europe too, just trying to fund project by project, you're not getting any of this sort of leverage potential, and it means you're not getting anywhere close to achieving the mission. And so we actually get locked in. Often I think by working too small, we get locked into not being able to do big. So anyway, an example of part of it, the sort of approach we try to bring in as we get more into the detail. Another key thing is that organising piece that I talked about. So that's really, again, this blend across municipalities and the whole community. And I think this is, again, most places have a few people working away valiantly on big ideas, and it's sort of in the fringes, even in some of the leading places, if they're lucky. And I've done lots of that work. So it's sort of, the concept here is, what's the team that would get your city to yes? So that's the mission. Yes, we can achieve it. So I guess like the NASA of the moon example, if you like. And what is that team, and how do they work with actors in the community currently? But almost by definition, it can't be any existing organisation's job to do this work, because they're all products of the system as it is. So how can it be anybody's? And Tony and I are talking, sorry, Tony, to keep calling you out, but long-term collaborator back here. And, a group of really passionate people around housing in Christchurch, but, 2 years of sort of problem identification and no capacity to get on and actually do any of this work about it. And we had sort of a good network, but no actual yes team, or a very small one. So again, trying to help cities and communities think through, so what's the sort of advisor, allies, the network like you across the community that bring in energy and expertise, probably in a light way, voluntary way, but in a really critical way. What's the sort of governance model that you will need? And again, this is about giving the actual space and permission for doing this work. So who do you need on board to help say yes, to get things going, but also at critical junctures kind of ram things through? And I'm sure you can think of examples, and then a core team in the middle that I'll come back to. So it's, within a sort of stakeholder map, you'll have people who will champion, but people who will block. And you need somehow to get that mix in and on board at that governance layer to actually have space to work. Again, I would like to catch up my experience and catching up as prep work. I watched Jim's talk on demand, and I did get that sense of there being strong champions and blockers here, and still a kind of gap between. That's the same everywhere. So and then within the core team, sort of who are some of the people that you need in that team? How would you start to structure this? And actually with the Southeast group, we're really sort of still working on this quite hard, and it's taking time. Within the wider group, the Leuven 2030 is one of the best examples of where sort of municipalities recognise, they're setting the mission already. They've recognised that it's bigger than the municipality, and so they're actually, down the track with setting up enough of an organisational model. And I think it's a really interesting question. How is it sort of formal enough and light enough to be able to hold this work and do it professionally, but not get, but to be able to hold the mission over time. And again, this is all a space for experimentation, which I suppose is how we think about, there's a huge gap. We are here, we know we have to get somewhere. So how do we find a way to do what we must when we can't know exactly how to do it? And again, that's where the sort of innovation piece is really helpful. So it's, we know we have to experiment, we know we have to try things. The question is, how do we create the space to sort of agree on the mission and resource the experimentation and give ourselves permission to actually try and fail? There's so many sort of programs, particularly public ones, are designed around, what's the really safe thing we can do with our money, and it'll be done next year, so we can, talk about it. And again, that's common everywhere. So if you think about, many of you are probably familiar with the idea of backcasting. So if we start from the mission, and we are there today, then working back to today in terms of what do we have to be doing now? Very often our strategy development is the sort of wish list of things we'd like to do next, and they're broadly commensurate, but usually with a gap and no real plan for implementation. So if you sort of go through this process, thinking about the mission and those enablers stuff, we find generally, I think, and like I say, we have a long way to go, that there's an awful lot we need to be doing now, well in the near term. And we try and help, the sort of framing of this, I suppose, is, I won't go into all of this, but thinking about getting that intent, the mission clear, thinking really, understanding the system of your city as it is, and then designing this portfolio of innovations. It's a bit like if you're a fund manager and you have a portfolio, you sort of spread your bets to try and manage your risks. And knowing that we won't get this right, how do we actually build a portfolio of work that we think is close enough but gives us enough space to learn and learn fast, fail fast, which again is very much that sort of entrepreneurship idea. And it's much easier if you're talking about building sort of widgets for a clear demand, but it's much harder in this layer. But it still matters. Again, there's too much sort of detail in here, but it's about some of the steps. And like I say, this is very emergent for us. We're definitely learning and failing ourselves as we try and build this sort of program model. And I guess, just in terms of scale, and echoing what I heard Jim, it was a bit sobering to see still the slides from TEDx 2011, but, this idea of using neighbourhoods, of using appropriate scale. So if we want to transform cities, and of course cities, aren't actually clearly bounded things in their own right, so it's really kind of regions, cities and towns within them, neighbourhoods within those of different scale. So it's really just, again, they're sort of working on the smallest scale to make complexity possible. We're trying to bring that's a key sort of strategy as well. So that was me, so it's, I'll stop there. I thought I would, before I need the helmet, I suppose, invite you to just sort of try it for a second. I gave you a couple of ideas, but just as a small segue, So run with me. So just take 10 seconds. In your mind, what does a perfect Christchurch look like to you in 2030? Just hold that in your head. What's the image that comes to mind? If you can find something to write with or take notes with, a piece of paper, a phone, your brain, whatever's most comfortable. This is harder. Try and write down a newspaper headline from your favourite publication. Doesn't matter. So what is a newspaper headline on the 3rd of March 2030, global, which describes Christchurch as you've just imagined it, and is telling the world all about it? So if you've chosen the Sun, you've probably got about 4 words. The Guardian, you've got about 8.
We've got an illustration on page.
I would like the headline that said that I'm still alive.
Try and hold that newspaper headline in your mind. It's quite hard to do in a few seconds, but we're not going to test. And so if, I hammered those other ones down this afternoon. So if you were to write down in one line, what should our mission be today, it will make that headline true, assuming 10 years. How would you define a mission for Christchurch? Like we said, we would need actually many on different layers. Forgetting about the past, we're today, we've got 10 years.
Not sure everybody up in.
It's good, cards are working. And I guess, from here, if you took that out, if you put those together, what would it take to come up with maybe 3 or 4 key missions for Christchurch that the whole community would get excited about, that could start to unlock this kind of process? Would anyone like to share what they came up with? I'll turn my microphone on.
This is whole world, is it?
No, just for Christchurch,
But we're telling the rest of the world what Christchurch is doing.
For the mission, so headline was about telling the world. For the mission, let's say you're telling Christchurch, for everybody.
Okay.
And just ideally it's something that everyone would agree with, would get on board with. One line, so assume like 10 words.
Yeah, okay.
So Gary will promise us to be ruthless.
On the headline in the press was, all beggars gone from streets into communal housing. And how did we achieve that? We communicated with Ngāi Tahu.
Jared, do you have?
Possibly not.
We'll tell you afterwards.
We usually do this over a day. So.
36,000 new houses in Christchurch opened yesterday. How do we get that?
Anything?
Christchurch used sea level rise canals to solve transport problems.
That mic's not working.
Mission? Did you manage?
Well, it solves 2 problems, sea level rise and transport.
Christchurch used sea level rise to solve mobility challenges in the city. And our mission, starting now?
Well, we used to have canals in Christchurch and we abandoned them.
We did.
We had the idea.
My headline would be using the inner, I call it red zone land, to farm and to create and to have vegetables and everything else so that our city, I know it's a long headline.
It's not a
Okay,
headline.
the headline is basically being self-sustained using red zone land so that when there's a virus and so on and so forth, we can actually feed our own people.
So, all Christchurch citizens fed from earthquake red zone land.
Yeah.
And what would the mission have to look like tomorrow? If we start on the mission tomorrow.
Start the power.
Christchurch leads the world. Christchurch leads the world as the best new city for climate change and greatest sustainability.
Roman Catholic Church moves its new building over for preserving black-billed God's creatures.
That's okay. I've been away for a while.
That's a good one.
Catholic Church has too, they just don't realise it.
Moving in.
So my goal is that less than 50% of Christchurch now have private ownership of cars, and the way to do that would be to be increasing the ridership on buses by 500%.
I'll build on the one from the front there. I'll build on the one from the front there. All major world cities now match Christchurch's standards of well-being and sustainability.
Very good. Any other desperately need to share?
Tony, surely.
Oh God. Well, you might be surprised. This is one that the council has already come up with, which is the vision for the city is a city of opportunity for all. That's the vision. But there's a community outcome, which is a 21st century garden city we can all be proud of.
Do we have a date?
And in fact, if you think back to Jim's talk a couple of weeks ago, he talked about the Garden City movement, which is ancient. Right. Anybody?
All right, Gary.
Every street living off its own vegetable supply.
All right, I'm willing to put the helmet on and take any questions, I suppose.
Hey, that was excellent. I'm wondering if Shane Jones' Provincial Growth Fund was a kind of mission, in this kind of idea. They gave him a pot of money. How much? $1 billion or whatever, to spend to enable, growth in the regions. And I suspect that they could benefit from some of this thinking in getting it more streamlined. But it's a really big picture. Kind of, yes, we have to do something about what's happening in the regions.
I think I don't know anything about it. Only observation from being back from 3 weeks is I've heard about it a few times, generally referred to as a slush fund.
That's right. Because it lacks the analysis that you have.
So I think it sounds like a fantastic commitment of resources to a recognised challenge. I would say, does it yet, and why not? Connect this sort of, and again, one of the key things. One of the key things is, I guess, thinking about that mission and that vision. It's working back from what are our children, what is our community, what does the world really need. So there might be $1 billion to start with, and will probably need to be more. But sort of, it's like put that $1 billion to a side. That's even think of that as seed money, and then do the mission, and then But if we had a $1 billion program for what we're doing at the moment, there would be.
It'd be amazing to get your thinking here into that kind of program, because I think it is a big picture.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right.
So advice welcome. often.
One of the things I think that's really important to actually talk about that provincial growth fund is it's very easy for those who have fought against provincialism to rubbish it and call it a slush fund. If you put a label on it and then a label on it that you don't like, then you can ignore what it should be doing. But in fact, if you think of us as an island, we actually have to have creative thinking as an island, because I gave a talk today on housing, and I said, why should all of the immigrants in New Zealand be encouraged to go and live in Auckland? It's compounding the problem. And so we need to actually start thinking, using this sort of thinking, for us both here as a city, but we actually need, because a small number of people, we need to think as an island. How would we think as an island would be my question.
What was the rough ticket for Christchurch till now? Is it still 40 billion, the number thrown around?
Ask Cam.
I've seen, I haven't digested, but I've seen some of the analysis. 10 years? I mean, if we put 50 million in here, with the permission that's needed here, into the sort of what could be done, which we were, Tony and I were sitting there back in the same spot having coffee, catching up on. I think, the value for money would have been off the chart. It's the hardest business case you'll ever make.
Instead, we got the blueprint.
Well, an enormous amount of money went into all of those things, but. So I guess to the growth fund, if there's $1 billion going, put 10 million in there and make sure that's all.
My headline was to do with connected, Christchurch being an interconnected hub of well-managed sustainable transport networks. But I'm interested in one thing that you said about in terms of what you would need to do and how you would get people along with you. And I guess the challenge for me is that sometimes I think without wanting to delve into being in an authoritarian regime, sometimes governments might need to make some very unpopular decisions to make some of this happening. So I'm just interested to hear your perspective on the balance between making decisions which will be uncomfortable for a lot of people but are nonetheless necessary to ensure a sustainable future, and the challenge of getting everybody along for the ride. Any comments on that?
It's hard everywhere. Assume that our current sort of ways of working aren't up to the job, and therefore, I think the Share an Idea initiative that started was really powerful. I'm personally still a bit lost as to why that wasn't kind of in here. And again, in the scheme of the level of investment, I offer up a few things like that because I know you will have answers, and I can guess, but I'm interested to hear more. But just I guess a quick story, like in the mobility space from Stockholm, when they wanted and told brilliantly by I think the deputy mayor that I heard a few years ago, and they wanted to do the congestion charge thing. Okay, it's just one piece of the puzzle, but it was something that within their, wouldn't be all the way here, but basically within their mission around mobility in Stockholm, that identified that as a key thing to do. Lots of experts said it was a good idea. Lots of polling said 70-odd% of people thought it was a bad idea. It's not hugely capital intensive, it's basically cameras and monitoring and stuff, and so they could take it on the chin. There's other infrastructure that it's harder. They said, we're going to put it in because the experts say it's a good idea. We recognise that as a community you currently don't like the idea. We'll give it 1 year, we'll have a referendum. If you don't like it, we promise to take it away. And I thought it was a really good balance of the sort of expertise kicking in and, what would Brexit look like if you could have tried before you bought, sort of thing. Referenda and I think, also a really powerful, the story was that, that wiped the 10-20% of traffic movement off that made all the difference. And so the experts were right, but no one could see it until they experienced it. So they had the referendum and 60-70% of people said we'll keep it, and I think, a number of years later they had another one and people said we'll keep it and we'll put the price up. And so it gave, again, we need that sort of, we believe the expertise, it fits, we need to give people that legitimacy. I think the other really exciting thing I see across Europe is the sort of citizens' assemblies model, and New Zealand's actually, in Australia, there's some people really good at this. So it's sort of, rather than canvassing everybody on complex issues, you take a really representative sample and let them deliberate. So what if the blueprint, in a kind of jury-based model, so you have to, over a period of time, be presented with expertise and then agree. And I think, really sadly, it was the mayor of Gdansk who was killed in Poland. But they had got to the point where, when they ran a citizens' assembly, they had an 80% agreement rate from the citizens' assembly. It became policy, no negotiation. And if it was 50 to 80 or something like that, it was advisory, and the council could take it further. I think it's those kind of models would have led to some pretty different design outcomes, I would say. They take work and money to make them happen.
Thanks, Tim. Around Europe, what are the best examples you've seen of solving the urban-rural divide and getting an entire region ticking as a whole?
I think for me it's a really interesting. So far, my work with Climate-KIC and has been more about sort of neighbourhood to city scale, but particularly where I work now, there are no mega cities. Slovenia is about 2 million people. Ljubljana is smaller than Christchurch as the capital. There's a lot of people live in kind of small settlements. So, as I mentioned, that sort of regional city, neighbourhood, town mix is far more diverse. There's some really interesting initiatives, so this is actually a series of things we call deep demonstrations. So I've talked about the cities one, but some of the others are sort of regions focused, and particularly focusing on some of the regions that are very carbon dependent, coal mining, steel, etc. So that sort of transition of regions, I think we have a lot of work to do to get that together, and also, that's why the need to work at a kind of country, region, city, neighbourhood scale, kind of regardless of the sort of boundaries that are there at the moment. One of the ones we're working with, the region, is Mondragon in Spain. I'm not super familiar with it, but a really big history of cooperative, but recognising they need to go to the next level. Emilia-Romagna in Italy as well, and Bologna and stuff. Lots of work to do there.
For the headline, I started thinking of borrowing from Jamie Lerner and Curativa, whose one was "Every Child is Loved," but extending that to every child is loved, feels loved, and feels a sense of place and a connection to the nature of that place. And I think from that, many other things have been mentioned, that we need good housing so people feel able to stay in a community and build community. You develop a city of a whole lot of interlinked villages where people feel part of a community and connected to the people there and connected to the nature there and able to grow their food there, etc., etc.
Can you repeat the question, please? I couldn't hear.
Maybe try the other microphone.
It was around this observation of the headline, I think, and all children feeling loved and connected to the food and nature of a place.
Sense of place.
And if everyone is loved and I guess loves their place, that's a really clear indicator that the whole place is working for everybody. So that, I think that's a pretty good mission.
It's a lovely one. Now, two quick ones. One quick one, two quick ones.
Mine's already been talked about it. Well, I really appreciate the sort of global look at what the problem domain is here. What I saw when you listed the cities there was principally a lot of cities with steel wheel transport networks, which we should be doing here, because that was the subject of my question, the 2030 suggestion you made. But the Northern Hemisphere, the heat map for the global climate change issue really is the Northern Hemisphere. That's the hot bit. The Southern Hemisphere is largely not responsible for this. And there is a real challenge around the sort of what I call Eurocentric look at the problem domain when the developing countries are really not being embraced in the solution space. Contraction and convergence embodies a solution that not only allows us to measure the success of what we do, the potential success of what we propose, but also embraces the burden of cost if we fail, so that we've got a contrast of what we need to do versus what it'll cost us if we fail. And yet contraction and convergence as an ideology has not been embraced in the Southern Hemisphere at all. What's your observation of that concept, and are you aware of what that might mean if we were to embrace it?
I mean, I think
half an hour answer there.
I mean, we're set up as a European organisation, so inherently that's where we're working, but we're keenly aware that when you look at development and what's going to happen in cities, and the potential to sort of go down the wrong path, if you like. Most of that development's not happening in Europe, that's happening in Africa and Asia. The sort of Europe's very much a refurbishment challenge, like the cities are there. It's like, well, how do you actually overhaul? And I guess that's where the time thing kicks in. I mean, that's why countries like, also New Zealand really, when you look at per capita, and certainly given the opportunities we have, those countries that have benefited most from the last 150 years of fossil fuel use surely have to be those that get off it first.
That's what drives this contraction and convergence solution, that there's a social justice and equity that needs to be resolved in the solution space, and that's what contraction and convergence is designed to solve.
Yep. So I mean, that's where the graph sort of, we desperately need places in Europe, New Zealand, showing that this can be done, because
of course the developing nations are people who have nothing to invest.
Yeah, and if you look at the sort of allowable carbon budget, New Zealand's or Europe's is very, very constant.
Right.
It's also very hard to connect that to the city scale, which is why.
Thank you, Tim. This is a really interesting framework, and maybe we should get Rod here at some stage to talk to us about an idea that a group of engineers have come up with.
There's more than engineers.
More than engineers, sorry.
Less than engineers.
Less than engineers. But of how to learn from the lessons from the earthquake and the rebuild, and how we can start planning for the future in a model like this. So we might move into that later. But the interesting thing is that we've actually got to, from my perspective, there's too much same as thinking. That the council, the regional council, the government are same as. They're all thinking the same way that they have, and that was part of the problem post-quakes. And so what we have to do as people is challenge the council to start thinking and operating in a very different way. Yep. And we've actually received a really, really good framework here tonight. Yeah. And so what we need to do now is actually line up the executive and line up our politicians and say, what are you going to do about this? And I want to tell you, just to finish, Tim, about that tree. We had, as a family, and this is life after death. We had, as a family, each of the toilets was decorated by different artists, and we were given 2 hours to clear our bar out by Sarah before they bowled it. And we went in and we said there was some beauty here that we want to preserve. And so Johnny got a pinch bar and he took that jib board off the wall, and that reflects something that lived beyond the death of our old business. The death of a place where a lot of people had a lot of fun. Yep. And what you're pointing out about that is actually there's new life in that, because we put it on the wall to remind ourselves that we all fell over and we're getting up again. So,
you can always take care of a tree when you transplant it.
Exactly. Thank you, Tim.